Hey folks, welcome into the News 12 Now desk. Thanks for joining us here on this Friday, June the 9th, just about 10:45 here on our Friday. We're joined by a very special guest today. We've got WRDW White House correspondent John Decker here joining us from D.C. John, first of all, thanks for joining us. We're talking today about former President Donald Trump indicted on 7 counts as it relates to that probe into the classified documents found in his Mar-a-Lago estate. So, John, first and foremost, you're a lawyer. When is this 7-page or 7-count indictment going to be unsealed?
Well, it could happen as early as today, Nick, but I think what is more likely is that it will be unsealed during the arraignment for former President Trump. That will take place Tuesday of next week at the federal courthouse in Miami, Florida. But we already know some elements as it relates to the charges. The charges include willful retention of national defense information. That falls under the umbrella of the Espionage Act. Also, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and lastly, making materially false statements to federal investigators. The charge related to obstruction, that's a pretty serious charge. Maximum penalty there, Nick, is 20 years in prison.
Yeah, some pretty serious charges being levied against the former president. It's reported there's a conspiracy count against Donald Trump as well. What does that tell you about the government's case against the former president?
Well, this is, to me, one of the most interesting aspects of this 7-count indictment. Conspiracy is a charge that always involves not only the person who's been charged, but another individual as well who is taking part in this scheme. And we'll learn what that scheme was. But that means that the federal prosecutors likely have a cooperating witness as it relates to the case that they're bringing against the former president. We don't know who that is. It may be spelled out in the indictment once it's unsealed. But to me, that's what that conspiracy count tells me about these charges that have been brought by the Justice Department.
Sure, and as we know, whenever there's something related to Donald Trump in the news, it's always going to garner a lot of reaction. What has been the reaction of this news?
Well, reaction from Republicans on the House side has been very typical. We've seen statements calling this announcement a political persecution. They call it a weaponization of the Department of Justice. Many statements indicating that, including one from the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. But we also have statements from some Republicans in the House, like Don Bacon of Nebraska, who says, hold off a moment, let's wait and see what these charges are once they're unsealed before jumping to any conclusions. And he also makes the point of saying everyone is presumed innocent in our justice system. And so that's what's happening on the House side. On the Senate side, very few statements, Nick, have been released by Republican senators. And that, to me, tells me a lot that they are not circling the wagons in the same way that Republican House members have been doing over the course of the past 12 hours.
Yeah, and even down here, we've got in Georgia, we've got some Trump allies, Marjorie Taylor Greene. We've got some people who haven't exactly been on his side, Governor Brian Kemp. So it's interesting to see kind of the response coming from different groups. So we've now got this legal process that we have to go through. What's the next step in that process?
The next step is this coming Tuesday. So what will happen Tuesday is the former president, Donald Trump, will voluntarily turn himself into federal authorities and show up with his lawyers at the federal courthouse in Miami, Florida. There he will be processed like any other individual who has been indicted. He'll be fingerprinted, he'll have his photograph taken for a mugshot, and then he'll be arraigned. He'll enter a plea of not guilty, and then he'll be released on his own recognizance. The next step in the process is determining a trial date for when this trial will actually start. And I would imagine that the lawyers for Donald Trump would like to delay this into 2025. But this is Florida. They have what's known as the rocket docket, which means that federal judges there like to dispose of their cases as quickly as possible. So I would not be surprised to see this particular case, this federal case, being scheduled to start in 2024 in the midst of the presidential campaign.
A presidential campaign in which he has garnered a lot of support, kind of dominating the polls right now. Were you surprised that this indictment is coming from the federal grand jury down there in South Florida?
I was. I think so many were, because so much of the work was happening right here in Washington, D.C., Nick. You know, they had an impaneled grand jury here in Washington looking at all of the evidence. But then we learned in the past week and a half that a grand jury has also been impaneled looking at evidence in Florida. And it makes the most sense to bring a case in Florida in this sense. Most of the alleged crimes, if not all of the alleged crimes, occurred at Mar-a-Lago in South Florida. And so that, I think, makes the most sense. Plus, I think federal prosecutors anticipated that if they were to bring this case in Washington, D.C., there would indeed have been a motion to move the venue to South Florida to try this case.
Yeah, and John, Donald Trump wasn't the only one with classified documents that we've heard of recently. We saw former Vice President Mike Pence, current President Joe Biden had classified documents. So what makes the Trump case different?
Well, that's right. On the surface, it looks like a very similar type of case. You have Pence, you have Biden, you have Trump, all in possession of classified material when they should not be in possession of that material. The difference being is the one key charge here, and that is obstruction of justice. There are no allegations of any obstruction of justice related to Mike Pence. In fact, that case has been cleared. He's been cleared. There is an ongoing case involving Joe Biden, but there's no allegation of obstruction in his particular case. But with Donald Trump, there is. And that's what makes his particular case so different from those others.
Right. And you said you anticipate this case possibly being delayed until 2025, at least. That would be the effort from the Trump team. Why is that? You know, what's the benefit of pushing it off until after the election?
I think what they're thinking of is what if? What if our client wins the Republican nomination? What if he wins the presidency? Or what if a Republican wins the presidency other than Donald Trump? The idea here being that in 2025, this is a federal case, the Republican could issue a pardon related to the former president. So I think that that is the thinking there, and that's the reason why they may be thinking they want to delay this into the 2025 year as opposed to during an election year 2024.
So, John, when these things first came about, it almost seemed like it helped Donald Trump in a way in the polls. We've seen him kind of grow his lead over Ron DeSantis and other challengers. What impact do you think this indictment has on the 2024 campaign?
I think this may have a similar effect. You know, we see statements of support for Donald Trump coming from his opponents, his challengers for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination. They've all put out statements essentially criticizing this case that's been brought by the Department of Justice. And we also saw when the former president was indicted by that grand jury in Manhattan, we saw his poll numbers, as you point out, Nick, go up. So in the short term, this could be good for Donald Trump in terms of securing the Republican nomination. But in the long term, I don't think this is a good thing for the former president. The idea for Donald Trump, the goal for Donald Trump, is to convince those who did not vote for him in 2020 to vote for him in 2024. And it's hard to see how an indictment, a 7-count indictment, is helpful in convincing those individuals to vote for him in 2024. So long-range picture, big picture, I don't think that this indictment is good news for the former president.
Yeah, we'll have to see how it all plays out here in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months as the 2024 campaign really heats up. So as you mentioned, John, the next big date is Tuesday. We will keep an eye on that. We do appreciate you giving us a little bit of insight there. News 12 Now White House correspondent John Decker joining us on this Friday. John, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Nick.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
You too.
So there you have it, folks. Like we said, John Decker joining us today. We do appreciate him giving us a little bit of time this morning, providing some of that insight for us from the nation's capital. And again, we'll just have to see how this all plays out in the next year to a year and a half as 2024 really ramps on. And this could be something, as you heard him say, could get delayed until the 2025 year after the election's already said and done. So we'll have to see how it all plays out. Okay, that's we're going to take a quick little 10-minute break. We'll be back at 11 o'clock with the Augusta Christian baseball team coming off a state championship. So Dan and I will have the latest there. We'll see you back here in a little bit.